What if Ben and Gwen weren't related? Episode 3. The episode begins with Ben reading some story about the lake that they were camping by. About some sort of lake creature. Gwen mocks him for believing in such nonsense before Ben then reminds her that he was able to turn into alien heroes and that he was thinking maybe the lake monster was actually some sort of alien themselves. Max then responds, "None that I've ever heard of," before getting a look from the children, and he just waves his arm saying, when you're as old as I am, you pick up on some things, before quickly changing the subject to their fishing trip. The next morning, the three of them walk to the docks with Gwen stating that fishing really isn't my thing. You have fun. I'm gonna catch some sun instead. Which Max then remarks that Gwen doesn't know what she's missing as he and Ben walk further on, going over to the boat that was floating by the docks. Getting onto the boat, after talking with the captain who'd introduced himself as Captain Shaw, they then headed on out, with Max asking about the fishing and anything interesting that they might see along with that. Though the captain says something about things being in the water that no one would believe, with Ben getting excited hearing about strange stuff in the water, thinking that sounded like fun, though Max reminded him it's a fishing trip, not a monster hunt. Pouting, Ben listened, and unlike in the show, Captain Shaw took them to what he thought was the #1 fishing spot on the lake, while laughing that the boy has quite the imagination there. Though when Ben asks about all the equipment, the captain states that it's for helping avoid large objects in the lake because there were big ships and other discarded stuff in the lake that sank by accident, as there used to be a bridge there a long time ago and he didn't want to hit it. Just as Max and Ben were about to cast out their lines, a newer boat appears and the people there begin talking, stating that there was an environmental study going on, and gets a baseball to the temple that the captain of the fishing boat had thrown, telling them to get lost because there was no such organization and they were illegally trying to stop them from fishing. Max does suggest that they turn around anyway, since the whole enjoyment of fishing with his grandson had been ruined by these guys. Captain Shaw then turns around to get back to the docks where Gwen had been relaxing on a chair enjoying her day away from Ben and his grandfather, getting a chance to simply relax instead. Since Ben didn't go hero to try to scare her the night before, Gwen was more inclined to pay attention to whatever was coming up as the fishing boat blew its horn and she could see Ben waving his arms in panic, making her get up and try to run from the docks. Though like in the show, the Kraken did come up and destroy the docks, sending everyone flying into the water since they didn't have time to react properly. Max tells Ben that they needed to save the people, to which Ben nodded and then jumped into the water, activating the watch. Since he'd been practicing with the watch between episodes, he'd remembered that this one was aquatic and so chose it and dove under the water to transform. Though it does screw up like in the show, however, instead of accelerate, he'd changed into heat blast, making Ben frustrated as he swam up to the surface to breathe. "Seriously, do you hate me or something?" he'd questioned the watch before his head then caught on fire again before deciding, forget it. And taking a deep breath, he'd swam back under the water to a ship that had sank and broke off part of the metal. Using the metal of the ship, he'd shot out of the water and flew off to save Gwen, though he'd used it more like a jet-powered surfboard. Since the metal wasn't aflame from all sides and still on top of the water, it thankfully didn't overheat, while the Kraken let out an enraged roar from just barely missing Gwen as Heat Blast saved her. He then took her to the shoreline and asked if she was alright, to which she'd responded that she thought so. Before they could say anything else, the Kraken then let out a roar and began to thrash around, prompting Ben to get back on the makeshift surfboard and use his flames to blast around the water, grabbing people as he went. The Kraken began going after the FOF ship before he could get the people to shore, making Heat Blast turn towards the ship and blasting over on the makeshift surfboard and throwing a few fireballs at the Kraken, making it turn away and dive under the water. He'd gotten the people he'd saved in the water onto the ship so that they could all get back to shore. The Kraken then shot up in front of the boat and began trying to grab a crate after ripping the tarp off of it, with the captain of the FOF boat trying to grab the crate. And Heat Blast fired a stream of flames at the monster, making it dive under the waters again. Once gone, he'd asked what was so important that he'd risk his life for it, and making up something, he'd claimed that it was their lunch, annoying Heat Blast. But before he could say anything more, the creature grabbed the crate again and dragged it under the water, with Heat Blast holding back the captain of the FOF boat, telling him it's not worth it for a few sandwiches. We later see people packing their stuff into their vehicles to get out of the area due to the monster attack that had happened that day, with Captain Shaw complaining about how the authorities had closed off the lake to the public, including him. When Max asked why that was a problem, Shaw stated that the lower deck of his fishing boat was his home, as he'd lived on his boat. He says that no one was going to keep him from his home, and began to walk off. Later that night, we see that Shaw had snuck onto his ship and began to move it out onto the lake, talking to himself, saying that the authorities can't stop me from getting to my home if I'm on the other side of the lake, before taking note of some sort of stowaway. He'd prepared to deal with the trespasser until he'd noticed that it was Ben, asking what he was doing there. Ben tries to explain that he was trying to find out what that Kraken wanted and why it suddenly attacked all those people. But Captain Shaw wasn't having it, telling Ben that, "I'll be contacting your grandfather once we're on the other side of the lake. No way I'm going back with those guys trying to keep me from my home," before taking note of some people ahead that had just dove into the lake from a speedboat. Shaw had decided that since he knew the lake better than anyone, he'd better go in after the daft fools before someone got hurt. Though Ben tried to suggest he goes too, Shaw wasn't having it and told him to stay put. Changing into a wetsuit and flippers along with a spear gun and scuba equipment, he told Ben to wish him luck before diving into the water. Ben did follow Shaw in an extra set of scuba gear that had been on the boat. They'd both swam down and saw the eggs, as the divers from earlier used some sort of device to allow them to move faster in the water, allowing them to hit the captain in the back of the head, only they'd also struck Ben too, taking them both back to the surface and blowing up Shaw's boat as they tied up Ben and Shaw. Gwen, in the meantime, was on her computer doing some digging before speaking to Mac. "Hey, I found something. Friends of Fish doesn't exist, but looking up info on that guy Jonah Melville, and it looks like that creep poaches and sells rare animals to collectors." She told Ben's grandfather about what she'd found out, to which Max asked if Ben heard that too, but getting no response, he walked over to Ben's bunk and yanked off the covers, finding a pile of clothes had been left in his stead. The two began freaking out, thinking that Ben did something stupid, which, he had. Ben and Shaw wake up later in a room tied up, and Ben complains about being captured like that, to which the captain states that they hadn't got them yet, while pulling out a knife that had been hidden on the inside of his belt, and began to cut the two of them free. Once the ropes were no longer binding them, the two went over to the door to test if they could get out. Finding it locked, but looking closer, Shaw noticed the keyhole resting under the knob. Taking the knife from earlier, he'd began to fiddle with the keyhole using it. "Hey, how do you know how to do this stuff anyway?" Ben questioned, seeing Captain Shaw pick the lock with a knife, to which he responds, "Well, let's just say I was quite the troublemaker in my youth." As he'd said that, he'd heard a clicking sound coming from the door. "Got it." As the two of them snuck out, Captain Shaw takes out a guard quietly and notices a payphone, and going through the guard's pockets, finds some change. We cut to Gwen, whose phone started ringing, and so she'd answered it. Hearing that it was Ben, she demanded to know what was going on, though Max couldn't hear the other end of the conversation. Gwen looks up and says to him, "They're at the cannery, we gotta hurry." As Ben and Shaw made their way out of the cannery, they spot the rust bucket, but hear the guys talking about the egg. Shaw picks up the loaded harpoon gun off the guy that they had just took out. He then tells Ben to stay put, wait for it to be safe, and then hightail it to his grandfather's camper. This gave Ben the chance to hit the watch without being noticed this time, actually getting Ripjaws. The episode mostly plays out the same with the exception that Shaw shot the glass of the underwater suit that Jonah had been wearing, causing a slight chip, before being smacked away into a wall and falling unconscious as Ripjaws then attacked, and we follow the underwater battle like in the show, except that the chip in the glass gave Ripjaws the edge, and it was actually him that ripped apart the suit after getting the eggs to safety. When Jonah tried the knife, Ripjaws grabbed and twisted Jonah's wrist, making him drop it before Jonah let out a pained expression and grunting underwater, making it so that he'd lost his air, giving Ben the chance to haul him up to the surface, leaving the Kraken with her eggs. The episode then ends with Ben, Max, and Gwen waking up Captain Shaw as the authorities were arresting Jonah and his crew.